on this computer. Okay. Good morning. My name is Sarah Huber. I'll be acting as the facilitator for today's STORM seminar. The STORM seminar is an open forum that features new research, technologies, policies, and news relating to stormwater. It is an effort stemming from the State Water Board's strategy to optimize resource management of stormwater, and it supports our mission of advancing the perspective that stormwater is a valuable resource. This is the first STORM seminar we've had since July 2019. Please enjoy and welcome. Let's begin with a little bit of logistics. This seminar is being recorded. The final recording will be posted along with other STORM seminars on our website soon. As you can see on the slide, the technical program will consist of about 45 minutes to an hour of presentation time, followed by about 30 minutes of Q&A. We invite you to email us questions via storms@waterboards.ca.gov. Daniel Delgado is tracking our account and will be compiling questions in the order of submission received. Any questions that we are unable to address by the end of this seminar will be compiled and shared with our speakers so that they can be answered directly later. If you are using more than one device to participate in this seminar, please pair them. Log in using your computer or tablet device, and then look up your unique participant ID. As illustrated on the slide, you will find that the number next to your name is in the participant window. When you call in by phone, you can use that ID to sync your phone with your primary visual observation device. And with that, let's jump into our technical program. STORMS is starting a bunch of new projects this year. One of those projects is going to be focused on the evaluation of stormwater program cost. We'll be reviewing and refining a report that was developed in 2019 through a collaborative effort of the water boards. Earlier this month, STORMS posted a copy of that report to our website. Two minor modifications were made to the original December 2019 version of that report. First, STORMS was designated as the document host and primary contact for questions. Two, we also expanded the references section to include the Office of Water Programs report that is going to be presented in this seminar today. I have provided a link to the December 2019 report at the bottom of this slide. It is in PDF format and is accessible, so you can go there and download it at your leisure. Over the next several years, the STORMS team will be gathering data and lessons learned from our ongoing statewide stormwater permit reissuance efforts. We plan to apply cost data collected from that effort and evaluate the protocols recommended in the report. We'll be exploring the data during datathons, seminars, and other efforts to evaluate and develop case studies. Now, I would like to take a quick moment to acknowledge that this STORM seminar was originally scheduled for June 4th, 2020. It was postponed out of respect for the ongoing Black Lives Matter protests and demonstrations. The water boards have a duty to protect water quality for all, regardless of race, socioeconomic capability, or any other factors. The STORMS team has heard your comments over the last several months at the Phase 2 MS4 permit workshops, the definition of microplastics in drinking water hearings, water board meetings, and other venues. We hear you when you say that cost is not only a consideration in stormwater program planning and implementation, but that it can have a disproportionate effect on low-income and disadvantaged communities. We invite you to help us understand that context and related efforts. Where are the gaps in the data or our understanding? As this STORMS project rolls out, please come, participate, be involved in our events. Share your lessons learned and any studies that you may have. If you have cost data that we don't have access to, share that too. As the STORMS project manager responsible for the cost project, I invite you to get in touch with me. I've provided my email on this particular slide. And now let's make it so that I just about start or stop talking. Today's seminar represents an independent analysis of publicly available data. The opinions expressed on the following slides are those of our presenter and not necessarily of the State Water Board. The State Water Board does not guarantee the accuracy or reliability of the information provided herein, but we are grateful to be a partner on this and other efforts. Now I'd like to introduce our main speaker for today. Eric Porsche is a research engineer in the Office of Water Programs at Sacramento State, and he is a visiting assistant researcher at UCLA's Institute of Environment and Sustainability. Eric studies cities and their effects on surrounding environmental systems. He holds a PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering from UC Davis, a master's degree in Public Policy from George Mason University, and a bachelor's degree in Engineering and Music from the University of Hartford. And now I'd like to turn it over to Eric. Thanks so much for being involved in the program. Oops.
Thanks, Sarah, and good morning. And before we start, I'll just appreciate the Water Board postponing the event originally from June. Apologies for any inconvenience that it caused. It might have given folks an opportunity to read through some of the materials in advance and provide better questions. But as we can see in the events of the last few days, the issues for the reasons we postponed previously have not gone away. So our thoughts go out to the folks in Wisconsin. And additionally, closer to home, just want to recognize all of the essential workers and municipal workers and utilities that have continued to keep the taps flowing and continue to keep the wastewater getting treated around California, and also hope everyone is staying safe with the fires. So with all of those disclaimers, given that it's 2020, let's begin. So today's program, I'm going to talk about a ongoing project, a set of projects, the latest of which we looked at municipal costs and spending for stormwater management in California. And this was through the Environmental Finance Center at Sacramento State. So we are the US EPA Region 9's Environmental Finance Center, and we've been working on this topic for some time, and this is sort of the latest in a series of products we've been compiling on costs and benefits around stormwater management. Next slide, please. So before I begin, I just want to provide a few acknowledgements. So the report that is available and all the data compiled within was a product of many of us at OWP. So David Babchanik is a student in our office and did the largest amount of work in finding the data sources and putting it all together. And Danielle Salt, a research engineer in our office, also did a huge amount of work trying to compile and standardize all of this information and sort of make it more presentable. And Brian Currier and Maureen Kerner as well at OWP, my colleagues, we were all sort of involved in putting this project together. A few additional acknowledgements, though. We wanted to make sure we gathered sufficient and used helpful input from lots of folks from around California. So the report was made infinitely better by comments and input from the Los Angeles Regional Board, the State Water Board Storms Group, and the Pacific Institute as well. And additionally from CASCA, EPA Region 9, Greg Pierce down at the UCLA Luskin Center for Innovation, and the regional water boards as well, all help to improve the interim and draft and late draft products. So thanks to that. And finally, just as a note, the work was funded as part of the cooperative agreement between the EPA Region 9 EFC at Sacramento State and EPA Region 9. And we also, it was internally funded by Office Water Programs. Next slide. So for those who may not be familiar, the Environmental Finance Center Network is a network of university-based centers across the US. We're funded through the US EPA, but we also get a large amount of funding and support and research from other sources as well. So the main focus of the EFCs is to work with communities and build local capacity to address environmental management needs. So a lot of it focuses on water, but The EFCs over the years have worked in a number of different sectors, and there's one in each region around the country, each of the EPA regions. So it's a strong network, and we have a lot of great collaborators across the country that we're in contact with on a regular basis on all sorts of topics. Next slide. Now, Sacramento State Office of Water Programs has been the EFC Region 9, the EFC for Region 9 since approximately 2016. And when we first began the EFC, which was actually before my time at OWP, started digging into asset management on stormwater. And so we've presented at this at CASCA and a few other forums over the years. We developed an asset management toolkit that's openly available. And then the EFC also was involved as part of the team with CASCA that assembled the funding portal. And so it's been a sort of a train of work that the EFC has been doing, largely related to kind of water utility system management and funding, but especially on stormwater for several years now. Next slide. So as a little bit of background, the EFC stormwater on our sort of funding project, asset management stormwater funding is an identified need in EPA Region 9 in California, as many communities know, but also at the US level as well. There was a national stormwater funding task force that recently published a report, which has a lot of interesting findings. So I encourage you to read that. And really across the country, many levels of government are recognizing the need for increased funding around stormwater management because it provides a lot of benefits to a lot of different sectors, anywhere from the urban planning sector through to water quality that can affect water supply. And so it's sort of becoming this sort of focal point of municipal interest around integrated issues of water quality, supply, as well as urban amenities and urban planning. Now, there's an identified need for additional funding and the need also for accumulated experience, and that's where the EFC has been working in collaboration with partners within California now for several years. I mentioned the asset management toolkit and the funding portal, trying to build capacity at the local level for stormwater utility managers to make the case to their governing boards that this is an important item that needs to be funded and addressed in their communities. And really the goal of the overall EFC line of work has been to provide technical assistance and to reduce what you might call barriers to entry. And these would be this would sort of be the classic problem where you're given such a huge task, it seems insurmountable. So the EFC's role has been to try to provide some ways to make that seem more surmountable and gain access to funding and expertise and sort of get folks started on this task. Next slide. This was a two-part project. We published the first part of this project in July 2019, and it's available on our website with the link below. And in the first part of the project, we wanted to assemble a guidebook with some examples and descriptions of kind of methods and best practices for evaluating benefits and costs in stormwater management. And this stemmed out of the work that we did to develop the asset management toolkit and sort of side conversations and technical assistance, more formal conversations with communities. We would often be getting questions of, well, where should I put this? Where should I categorize this cost or this benefit, or what's a good unit cost to use here? And so that was the motivation for part one of the guidebook, to try to provide a central repository for this. And we searched all of the literature that's available and compiled it, and then tried to tailor it more towards the task of stormwater management, specifically for California, but also relevant across the country. And then part two that we're talking about today, where we're evaluating data on reported costs, what has been a gap for a number of years that I'll talk about, which is why we identified it as being a useful contribution to the overall discussion here around stormwater management, finance, and funding. Next slide. So a little bit more on part one, that guidebook content. We tried to make it sort of approachable. Sometimes these finance terms don't seem to, they're not the most interesting to read from a starting point. So we're trying to make it approachable. We demonstrated examples of how you might undertake different sort of calculations for costs and benefits, some of the basic kind of finance terms to kind of get stormwater utility community in California better able to talk with, say, the finance folks in your municipality or your county, or better able to sort of scope a project and identify, say, difference between capital costs and O&M costs and so forth. And again, kind of helping to provide tools to get folks started on this question. Next slide. Now what we'll talk about today is our part two of the project, where we looked at spending in California. And just as a quick overview, I'm going to go into a lot of the detail on all these steps going forward. But part two, as we scoped it, we wanted to collect data on stormwater spending in California and just examine what the best available data for the current state of funding was. And potentially, depending on the results, it could help to inform what the sort of line items that are used by communities around. That was kind of our idea going into this. So we surveyed, hundreds of sources from cities and counties, looked at budgets and expenditures, and we normalized all this spending to be able to create kind of, a more a better snapshot, a comparable snapshot. And it was a very labor-intensive exercise because this is the process of standardizing the data that we found was quite difficult. I'll talk about why that is in going forward. And then, as I mentioned, we tried to extensively get reviews and comments from the experts in the community around California to better inform the results and sort of scope the findings to be helpful. And I'll say a few times throughout the report that we focused on publicly available data that could be found through open searches. And that's not to say that there isn't a lot more data on stormwater costs in California within all the communities, but given time, scope, and resources and budget, we did focus on the publicly available data because that's the data that can create a long-term record that is comparable and trackable over time and can be reported on and standardized to give better snapshots for regulatory managers, for industry folks, and provides a positive feedback loop in that regard. Next slide, please. Stepping back, if you're going to look at ways to estimate stormwater spending, there's a few different ways you might try to do it. So first, you could just ask surveys. And this was the method that was used in 2005 by Brian Currier and colleagues here at OWP. You can also look at case studies and extrapolations. So identify some communities that have implemented good reporting, and you make extrapolations based on how much that spending is, and you could potentially extrapolate funding gaps as well. And there's some case study, there's some examples of this that I'll mention as well in California. You can use economic and engineering modeling. This is an example of this often is used for, say, capital expenditures, say large green infrastructure planning, where general unit costs of green infrastructure, for instance, and you use engineering modeling to figure out sizing, so you know how much a particular device might cost. Sometimes that can be a little bit less useful, though, when you're thinking about some types of program expenses, where modeling won't necessarily help you identify, say, street sweeping requirements or something like that. And then finally, scouring and integrating available data. So this is kind of a new emergent sector in terms of its scale. So we've always looked for data in lots of different places. But the amount of data that's being published now is pretty significant. And if you're going to look at this option, then you have to consider what type of data is available. And there's a few different types. You could have structured data. And you can think of structured data as being tables that are easily comparable that you can fill out. You can have unstructured data. An example might be a newspaper. It has a lot of information in it, but it's rather unstructured. And then there's somewhere in between. And so if you're going to scour and integrate available data, you have to try to find all the available structured and unstructured data and get it into a form that's structured as much as possible so you can normalize it and compare it. And that ended up being what the tactic that we took here. Next slide. But before we decided, we looked at some of the past work on municipal spending for stormwater management. And this has been an issue in California for over a decade, since essentially the implementation of the Clean Water Act, of course. So in 2005, as I mentioned, at OWP, we published the Stormwater Cost Survey, and we surveyed 10 municipalities and found that annual spending ranged from $18 to $46 per capita. And we also had sort of detailed line items about different types of spending. And then in 2014, as part of a report on paying for water, was the title, the Public Policy Institute of California estimated annual stormwater funding needs range from $1 to $1.5 billion, and the current funding was no more than $500 to $800 million. And this was based on some extrapolations from detailed reporting from a few particular communities. Next slide. So after looking at the existing data, sort of the first thing that I did is went over and chatted with my colleague Brian Currier, because I wanted to hear about the experiences in implementing the 2005 report. And in that report, actually, it identified some potential sources of annual audited financial municipal reports. And these are reports that are published to comply with the Government Accountability Standards Board, and they generally have rather standardized reporting that goes through an independent audit. So its standardization and repeatability is fairly high, and so the comparability then would be fairly high. Now, there are also another potential sources out there, and we started looking around at some of those other sources and talking to folks in the community about what sorts of sources might be available. And we identified a few, and we started looking into those. So Stormwater Program annual reports, these turned out to be a really excellent source of cost information, but they were generally found in PDFs, either on a municipal website. Sometimes they were uploaded into the State Water Board's reporting system, but it depended upon the region. And the variability, there was significant variability across the state in terms of the level of detail and the frequency of reporting. So some might report just for a few years, some might report a longer record, some might report, a more standardized sort of format broken down by line items, and others just kind of provide lump sum values. And you'll see some examples of that. Another potential source are the MS4 permits and other reporting, but these generally relate to water quality. And we scoured through to see if there was any nuggets about sort of program implementation for hours that could be standardized. And generally, these did not turn out to be a fruitful source of documented spending and costs. And then finally, there are the regional watershed planning documents. In some regions, they go by different names, but some of them provides costs on potential stormwater program expenses. They're often, though, focused on long-term investment needs, and they may not be implementation costs, but rather bid costs or estimated like future scoping costs. Next slide. So of the sources we found, as I mentioned, the Stormwater Annual Report seemed to be one of the most fruitful, though we did compile a few different sources from different municipal areas. But we found, of the publicly available reports that we could find basically through open searches, these two maps provide kind of the coverage of what was available. And on the right-hand side, you'll see county level reporting. On the left-hand side, you'll see the municipal, city, or local district level reporting as well. So obviously a few trends pop out here that it's heavily focused on of the available reporting. A significant amount of reporting came out of Southern California and especially the coastal Southern California communities. There was representation by cities throughout the Central Valley, and a few examples from the Bay Area, but generally the Bay Area was an underrepresented group in this available. So in some of the consultations we've had and discussions on the draft products, it sounds like there's more data and information out there to be compiled that maybe wasn't available in a fully public format, even though it was generally within the public record. So I think going forward, the way that this project scoped up was not necessarily as a comprehensive snapshot of all of the activity around stormwater management that's taking place, but how you might go about doing it. Going into this, we didn't know that. We weren't sure. We thought maybe there was, some nuggets of data and you could use sort of a big data scouring approach to find this out. But in the end, what we identified was here is a method you could use for standardizing all this information and showing the value of being standardized. But ultimately, in order to come up with a statewide snapshot, you'd have to do some additional extrapolations. Next slide. So you can see a little bit of the challenges we face when we look at different sources. Here's some variations in reporting formats from two different municipalities. So on the left-hand side, you see a very detailed record over the course of 10 or 12 years with line items of specific spending on specific items. This was sort of an example of one of the most detailed examples. And then on the right, you'll see a much more summarized expenditure summary for stormwater management. And sometimes the source of the data would be the reason for this. So on the right-hand side, this coming from a general reporting fund, stormwater management, program management was broken out as a line item, perhaps because it was an enterprise within this particular utility, or perhaps because it was advantageous because it had a line item of funding. But this wasn't always the case because stormwater can be lumped in with all sorts of other public works, just public works activities. The level of detail that happens in the most standardized form of reporting, those audited financial reports, generally makes it, it does not lend itself to the sorts of detail that the stormwater management community needs for cost reporting and evaluating costs. So the table on the left is much more informative in that regard, but then it lends itself to being less standardized. So this was the challenge we had. Can we sort of compile these different types of sources at different scales into a single snapshot of spending across the state from available sources? Next slide. So we spent a few months scouring whatever we could to try to find sources. Well, we looked in started with the state water board reporting, and we looked, sort of had some conversations with state water board folks as well as regional water board folks who had been engaged on this issue to get an idea about the state of information. And then we essentially created a list of phase 1 and phase 2 municipalities from the permits and just kind of went down and did record checking as best we could. So if we couldn't find any information, say in a centralized database, then could we find it on local websites? And I'd say that we did, it was an exhaustive but not comprehensive search, I'd say. So we spent a lot of time trying to find available information, but we sort of describe in the report on multiple occasions that it's not comprehensive because there were plenty of locations around the state that have active stormwater management programs that did not get described and captured in the report, perhaps because we didn't find the information or perhaps because it was not available in the publicly or in a public site, public fashion. So you'll see here in this graph that the majority of the reporting is in more recent years, with 2011, 12, and 2015, 16 having the most amount of reporting. And these would be the individual records that we had. So in some communities, the reporting found that there was a long, like I had mentioned, sort of multiple years of reporting. In other communities, it was a single year of reporting, or maybe 1 or 2 recent years of reporting. And this sort of varied across the different reports. So these graphs represent individual records of an expenditure within a municipality, city, county, or flood control district across California for the communities that we found information for. Next slide. So we have that record of information in varying geography, by varying geography and varying time across the state, and how you kind of bubble that up to get an annual snapshot of spending. So the procedure we used was to essentially standardize the variations in reporting over time in categories through a multi-step procedure. So we, in order to standardize for moving from multiple years into one single year, we used the most recent representative year. And so this would be, it was expert judgment for each of the reports and examples that we had, look at what the most recent representative year was. And it wasn't always the most recent year. Often it was, but it wasn't always the most representative year, because on occasion, within these sources, the budgets and expenditures might vary because there's a change in the course of the year over what was projected versus what was actually spent. This is a natural procedure of municipal spending, and doesn't represent anything about the planning that went into that year one way or another. So these changes sometimes would influence what seemed to be the kind of the most recent representative year. And so we used a representative year as being consistent with sort of 1 or 2 prior years. Another reason that a year might not have been representative is that there was a large grant influx of funding in that particular year. And so that was noted as a line item of spending, but it certainly wouldn't be representative of long-term expenditures or budget inputs. So if we identified that being the case, then we tried to consider another year that didn't have, say, a large grant influx of funding. So after we did all the after we looked at all for the representative years for the standardization, we identified that in 2015 and 16, for when we were doing this work in 2019, seemed to be the largest number of representative years, but there were some more recent reporting after that. And then in order to be able to compare them, we adjusted for inflation, just using the Consumer Price Index, basic inflation adjustment indicator. Next slide. Another process of standardization was grouping the stormwater costs. And this is, we described how we did this in the asset management toolkit and also in the Part 1 report, because there are different ways that municipalities or counties classify stormwater expenditures and budgets, but generally they do fall into some number of categories. So we tried to figure out how to standardize these. And you might think about 3 buckets that we use within the asset management toolkit. So you have permit compliance and program management. You have existing infrastructure, including operations and maintenance. And you have new infrastructure, capital costs, and new investments. There's not always a clear delineation between these categories, and that's been a source of discussion and debate, I think, within the community, and rightly so, because differences in how municipalities structure their local governance, local accounting, local finance, or their individual programs can influence how you might record budgets and expenses in line items. Next slide. So we would take these tables that we found in the primarily PDF documents of the annual reporting or a few other sources. And in order to create more standardized categories, we used an iterative process. So we recorded, for each municipality, we would record the line item, and then we would make a record of it within just Excel spreadsheets. And then we would use kind of expert judgment to categorize the costs into resultant categories. And we started with the set of minimum control measures that are within the permits, and then we added to it. So if something didn't fit into so something was a line item within a budget that was reported as, or an expenditure that was reported by a municipality, then the resultant category, if it didn't fit into one, we would add it to the resultant categories. And we did this through all of the different reporting, and then we also recorded the cost and the location and a number of other attributes associated with that to create this large record. Then through the iterative process, we streamlined this resultant categorization scheme into categories and activities. And there were always questions and judgments that come into this kind of standardization process. So for instance, I give an example at the bottom, operations and maintenance costs for trash and debris control. Would it be considered as pollution prevention and good housekeeping, or operations and maintenance? You can make an argument for either. Potentially, it would depend on the municipality's accounting procedures and particular interpretations of these activities or how they're paying for them as to where it might go. This is the process of standardization that makes the detailed assessment of stormwater program management costs and expenditures and budgets in California quite difficult, because there was this variety in these activities and the categorizations. Nonetheless, we did our best, and we provided that as an appendix to the report, the sort of the summary, call it a typology of categorizations, the resulting categories of spending, and the associated activities with that as well. Next slide. So after we standardized the spending information and then standardized the cost reporting categories, we were able to start to look at trends. And we looked at trends in terms of geography, in terms of jurisdictional type, and in terms of categories of spending. So I'm going to present some summary graphs here, but we have a lot more detail in the report, and we provided all of individual data records as well as the graphs and procedures for creating all of the detail in the report as separate supplemental files in order to create a record that's reproducible over the long term. So I encourage you to check those out for more detail. So here you can see two summary graphs. On the left is average annual expenditures by entity type, and on the right is total annual expenditures by entity type. And this might not necessarily be a surprise for folks who have been in the community for some amount of time, but it starts to create some overall kind of summary trends across the state for what we found was available. So of the average annual expenditures, you see a fairly even breakdown between counties and flood control districts in terms of their average annual spending. But the cities and the other category, which would include some special districts, port authorities, and so forth, was significantly less. But of course, if you look at total annual expenditures, municipal spending at the more local level with cities is significantly greater than counties or flood control districts. These sorts of insights are useful, and they also highlight some of the difficulties you identify with coming up with spending categorizations, because many of these communities are, of course, working together. They have joint programs with the regional watershed group or within county functions, and the reporting doesn't necessarily differentiate that effectively. So that's another kind of level of uncertainty that within the reporting costs that might want to be addressed in future as future actions are taken. Next slide. So this is the spending category, spending by breakdown by those categories that I showed you, and we have a lot more detail in the report and the supplemental data on this. But you can see that big chunks of funding go toward, that were categorized, self-categorized by communities, go to pollution prevention, capital costs, as well as public education and involvement in operations and maintenance. And so you can look at this data in sort of two ways. You can look at total annual expenditures in the first numerical column, or the average expenditures with the average and standard deviation, and these are all in millions of dollars across all the different entity types. Next slide. Now, of course, there's huge diversity. And these sorts of box and whisker plots will help to demonstrate that. So the box and whisker plot will show you average, the quartiles, as well as the outliers. And so you can see, the largest bars here are associated with those three of those categories that I highlighted being a significant amount of spending. They also have significant diversity within them too, because communities that have stormwater management activities, they vary in size and they vary in sort of geographic area and population as well. So capital costs, operations and maintenance, and pollution prevention still, through a kind of a box and whisker outlier analysis are the largest categories, but you can see there are a few outlier communities that are outlier entities that are spending, significantly more, and this would be related to jurisdictional area or local conditions. Next slide. So spending by population and area as well. Again, I'll couch this based on the publicly available data that we found that was exhaustive but not comprehensive. Based on what we found across the different reporting and communities, you can see the per capita expenditures, and we also looked at unit area expenditures. Now this would only be for cities. Why? Because with a city, you can figure out what the jurisdictional area would be, and you can make an assumption the jurisdictional area would be equal to the watershed area. But with counties, you're not sure where exactly they're spending the stormwater management funds. So is it a regional program or is it more local programs? There wasn't quite enough detail in the reporting, and in the instances that there were, it sort of went beyond the scope of resources for our budget to kind of dig into this. So what's listed here is across the different regions for the data that we found, the per capita expenditures in the first column, ranging from a little bit, something less than $10 per capita up through about $50 per capita. And then in the second numerical column is the unit area expenditures, where you take the total spending and divide by the square miles within a municipal jurisdiction. And then the last column provides, you can see that, again, the heavy dominance from Southern and Coastal California for the publicly available data, but certainly there would be more available in other regions through a more extensive project. What's notable is that you can, after standardizing these, you can start to compare them to some of the existing findings over time. And so as more data becomes available, you could standardize this for updates with inflation, and then look at, say, the past sources, the 2005 OWP source or other sources that are available to know how spending is changing over time, whether it's keeping up with inflation or whether it's tracking below inflation, whether there are significant new requirements, but not significant new investments, and those sorts of important trends that become part of the policy discussion. Next slide. So there are a lot more, there's a lot further information and data available within the reporting, and I encourage you to check it out. And you can always feel free to email us as well with any questions. But I'll just close with a few summary conclusions. So this kind of project, the Part 2 project, from what we found, is the largest compilation of data on stormwater spending to date. And so we identified approximately $800 million in spending. Now, this is also an underestimate, but it's a pretty good start. And it also outlines kind of the methodology you would use through this data scouring approach. And I think that there's a few advantages to the data scouring approach, if potentially with a couple of improvements. So the scouring approach found that there's a lot of information that's out there, and a bit more to be uncovered as well within California and through existing reporting, but standardizing it is a significant amount of work. So if there can be some additional work to standardize it and move it through better reporting streams, I think it would reduce the amount of time and effort for folks on both sides of this, on all sides of this question. You'd say from the kind of the regulatory side as well as the municipal reporting side, because it's fairly obvious that there's a lot of work going on at the local and regional level to evaluate costs, and there's also a lot of work going on at the state level to figure out how to put this together, and identifying a data management algorithm procedure to be able to do this would significantly improve the availability of information and reduce kind of the transaction costs of moving it.
Eric, are you still there?
Labor intensive to compile, and there would be a significant amount of work. It took us approximately 6 to 7 months to be able to do this, working with our partners. I'm working within our office, and then also collaborating with our partners. And finally, as I'll close, we need to invest in efficient ways for collecting electronic documents, as I mentioned. And we can move this sort of reporting scheme into more electronic formats, and I think it would benefit the multiple communities that participate. Next slide. Here's all the information and links. We'll leave this up there, and we encourage you to check out the reporting. And please do email us with any questions at the EFC. And we're also always interested to hear about sort of the needs and gaps that are out there on this particular issue, to potentially provide technical assistance or provide any kind of further summary products in this regard. So with that, I'll close and turn it back over to Sarah.
Great. No, that was a fantastic presentation, Eric. We really appreciated your willingness to jump on to this storm seminar and also walk us through part 2 of the guidebook. In addition, providing great references to how to use the greater toolbox now and in the future. So thank you. This, I think, is going to be an invaluable tool both for municipalities that are on the implementation side of the coin, as well as the state water boards as we consider this moving forward. As the team prepares for Q&A, I want to remind everybody that you are able to submit us questions via email using our Storms account, storms@waterboards.ca.gov. Before we start with our first series of questions, Daniel, cueing you to start doing a count and organizing the paperwork, I'm going to make an attempt to launch a Zoom poll. In this particular poll, I would like to get feedback from those of you with computer access to see if there is interest in being involved in this or other storms-related cost projects. As we move forward, we would potentially be working with Office of Water Programs, Eric and his team, to understand, use this data that has been provided, understand whether or not or how the data gaps potentially exist, and just feel out different opportunities to share lessons learned in forums like this one. So I'm going to allow all the participants that have this capability to respond for about another 20 seconds, and then I'll end polling and we can see the results. I will be able to download this information, and that would include your contact information, and I'll basically do a blind copy response so that you are acknowledged based on your interest. All right, I'm going to end polling, and I'm going to share the results. So as you can see, there is about 19 individuals, or 30% of our participants interested in datathons and workshops. Thank you so much. There's 49 individuals, or 94% of our participation, interested in storm seminars like this one. So making a mental note that this is definitely a popular topic. And there is a level of interest on joining the email list, sharing cost data, thank you very much, and being involved in our case studies. So thank you. That was most excellent. I'm going to stop sharing this poll and hope that I get the results later. And now I would like to turn it over to Daniel Delgado. You've been tracking our storms email. How many questions do we have in the queue, and what's the first one to be named?
We currently have 2 questions. The first one was sent in before the seminar began. It's from Fred, who did not identify an organization, but he has 2 questions. His questions are, does the report include the budget and spending of Caltrans, which is the largest MS4 in the state? Additionally, I'm wondering if the Caltrans funding going to other MS4s is included. Caltrans funding comes from the state highway account. The stormwater management program budget is approximately $108 million for 2018 through 2019. This does not include project-related capital construction and capital outlay support costs.
It does not include the Caltrans reporting. The Caltrans direct expenditures, out of full disclosure, our office works with Caltrans and has actually, it's how the stormwater program at OWP got started. But we focus more on the municipal side because that's been the focus of OWP's technical assistance for a long time. That as a caveat though, to the extent that municipalities, communities, cities, counties might have been reporting expenditures through Caltrans local grant programs, those would have been captured if they were in the reports that we surveyed.
Awesome, thank you so much, Eric. Daniel, what is our second question? And everybody on the phone or on the meeting, you are free to continue sending us things in. We'll keep on tracking that now and into the future. So question number 2, Daniel.
Next question comes from Stacy, representing LA Metro. The question is, what kind of financial information is provided in stormwater annual reports? I don't input any construction annual reports. Or excuse me, I don't input any in construction annual reports.
So I guess I can take a first attempt at that, and then Eric, you can follow after me. At this time, cost data is not currently an obligation of the construction general permit. I do not believe it's a part of the industrial general permit, which are 2 statewide permits that we have. I'm not 100% sure whether or not there is any functionality for that in the Phase 2 MS4 permit. Eric, correct me. I know you had some Phase 2 data, but I'm not sure what that looked like.
We surveyed Phase 2 sources, but for the most part, there was a mix of reporting, and I don't have the background, the summary numbers on hand, but it is listed in the database as the breakdown between Phase 1 and Phase 2 reporting. So primarily here, these would be Phase 1 municipal programs that include some amount of capital cost in some of the reporting, but also the program management expenses, education, things like that.
Great, and just to reiterate that this particular analysis and the storms project that I was alluding to earlier really is focused on municipal stormwater program cost implementation, we do recognize that there are significant costs or cost efforts associated with implementation of these other permits. But because the question related to tracking and reporting cost can be, as presented today, quite complex, complicated, and potentially variable over time, we are focusing first and foremost on the municipal question, in part because we do have a history of the data and a very, very strong collaboration with our stakeholder groups to understand that data through case studies and other venues. However, as the Storms project manager, if you do have cost data that is in perhaps an Excel format that would make sense to be shared, I am open to receiving that. If that is a desirable potential focus question or case study, I am open to having that conversation. In terms of other permit data, we will see where this sort of evolves in the future. But at this particular point of time, we are focusing on evaluating what we have and where it stands as of 2020. Daniel, do we have any other questions in the email chat before I start potentially throwing some at Eric myself?
Yes, we are starting to get some emails coming in. So I have a couple more questions. This first one is from Jim representing California Natural Resources Agency. Their question is, roughly what proportion of the data that was scoured was already in machine readable format versus needed to be transcribed from a printed format, digital or paper, or some sort of vector plot?
The amount of information that was in a machine readable format was probably close to about 2%, maybe 1%. Now, with newer PDFs, it becomes a little bit easier because you can copy Adobe tables directly, but we went report by report, and especially I'll give the credit to David Babjanik, our fantastic student at OWP, who made the data machine readable because it was generally not in a form that was machine readable previously.
And I have another question from Stacy representing LA Metro. How can this work be used to help an agency properly budget for upcoming projects? How much of a construction project should be allocated to stormwater management?
That is a tricky question. And at the outset, we considered that an outcome of the project might be some summary guidance in regions to provide that sort of information. As we talked with the stakeholder, kind of gained feedback from groups, there was, I think, a lot of input that cautioned against doing that. And I think that comes from maybe a few different sources. One, the time frame of this reporting in terms of using it for future planning or several years out. So there's a potential discrepancy in time that takes place there. Then two is the way that you kind of like break down the percent of costs within, say, a stormwater program between different activities will probably vary over time, right? And so I think that some of the cautions came up as saying against using this as a method to inform, say, direct line item costs or, say, general percentage breakdowns. But with some additional data and a little bit more, a longer line of reporting, I think that is possible. And you could certainly go into the data records within your region, say, within the Los Angeles region, and dig out through some quick Excel graphs the percentage that various entities are spending on capital expenditures versus program expenditures, or more to the question, how much stormwater management might be, constitute for a particular project. The problem, though, for that individual question is that oftentimes the the capital, like the project-based reporting for capital investment might be more summary and not a line item breakdown of the project costs for that individual project. And so when you have a huge repository of data, you can always tease out, inferences, but I guess the community had, this feedback we received after they had a chance to sort of evaluate the report, cautioned against doing that at this time. And I think that there's some wisdom in that.
Great, Daniel, what's the next question?
We have a question from Kristen from Insignia Environmental. The question is, will there be another study done for MS4 Phase 2 entities, specifically schools?
I'm going to take a quick stab at that, and then Eric, you can speak for Office of Water Programs' future potential endeavors. So at this particular venue and venture, that particular study is not intended, but it could potentially be a engagement effort as a part of our Storms project. That particular piece of the pie has not been fully fleshed out or contemplated as of yet. I will say the Storms project will probably be a little bit delayed in kicking off. Our efforts will probably start with things like seminars as we gather data and lessons learned. And so if there are schools that wish to be involved or engaged with that process or help us develop case studies, we enthusiastically embrace you. And I invite you to get a hold of me, sarah.huber@waterboards.ca.gov. It is in the slide deck, and I am the one that sent out the invites for this meeting. So I'm going to pause and let Eric take away next steps for his program.
We did look around for some data on schools, and the reason for that was my colleague Maureen led a guidance for LID in schools document that we published in 2019, and we presented it at Casca and other locations on this. That document provided guidance on kind of project implementation, and some of the categorizations schemes were applied in that documentation as well, but it didn't specifically identify how much particular projects had cost at particular school locations. So the result, however, from the searching was that we didn't really find a lot of information that was available. So I'm not sure that that data scouring approach would really work here. I think you'd have to look more for a direct implemented survey of schools that have been actively engaged in this, and it could be something of interest. So if there was a value to the community in that regard, OWP certainly has some of the background in putting together that 2019 guidance document to sort of help to shape that for whoever might take it on.
Yeah, and I just like to follow up to that resource that Eric just cited, the school's LID guidance actually does live on the Storms website under the other documents section of our webpage. And there is information related to cost evaluation protocols and asset management in a very similar form as what is referenced in the guidance document that Eric talked about today, or the guidebook, sorry, that Eric talked about today. So I promise to follow up after this particular meeting, and when I post or share the recording link, I can include a link to that school's LID document as well. Daniel, what's our next question?
Question from Jim, representing Carollo Engineers. What is included in the category pollution prevention?
I don't have the activity list offhand, but that was a varied category because it did, there was some local judgment that took place. And so as a little more detail on the categorization scheme, that iterative process, We generally took what a community listed as the way we recorded the information, unless there was some significant need to recode it to a different category. So in some reports, you'd see almost the same kind of category activity scheme, so pollution prevention, and then a number of different activities under there. And then in others, you would just see sort of the activity listed, but it matched an activity that was generally falling under pollution prevention. So that was actually one of the hardest categories that we did a lot of iterative work on. And we have the full list of the activities that are included in that within the technical appendices, one of the attached spreadsheets. So that'll be a better answer, more detailed answer than this right here, but so I'll welcome you to check that out.
And we got the last question so far is from David, who is representing Burns and McDonnell Engineering. They have two questions. First, what are the last 5 years last 5 years trends in spending? And then the second question is Storms also looking at program effectiveness in terms of what program goals, for example, pollutant load reductions, are being met compared to annual costs?
So on the first question, I can answer that. There were a handful of communities that provided enough data over time. And in the report, we demonstrated, or we showed some of those communities and how it broke down by region. Generally, over the last 5 years, trending with inflation was what we saw. There was not a significant increase or decrease in spending within the communities that were reporting. But that was limited based on a self-reported set of folks who were demonstrating how much they were spending over time. So it wouldn't be a kind of a comprehensive snapshot of how things are changing over the course of 5 years. And I'll let Sarah answer the second one.
So just like Eric said earlier, I think that is a potentially complicated but interesting question or scenario to explore. What is the relationship between cost and potential load reduction? However, I'm not sure that we have the data in a form with which to correctly, adequately, or understand that question and answer fully. I think what our next right steps really would be to pair additional data that we know exists with this fantastic resource and database that was generated through the Office of Water Programs Part 2 report. I would invite everybody to download that and start seeing what is available in the existing compiled publicly available data set, and maybe start having engaged conversations with me or our team to understand where we can maybe compile more data. And if when we do a future datathon or data evaluation or case study effort, which again I think would start possibly in 2021 to be determined, we would then be able to see if we had adequate data with which to make any kind of analysis of that sort. I think it might be possible with select minimum control measures. I am not 100% sure what the data looks like on LID implementation. And so we'll basically be informed on our ability to address that question based on the data and case studies. Daniel, do we have any other questions in the queue?
At this moment, we do not have any further questions.
Well, I will allow another couple moments for anybody to send in an emailed question. If you are on the chat and are able to see the yes, no buttons, if you have any burning desires, I suggest please click on the yes checkbox, and the team will scroll through over the next moment or so to see if that pops in. And in the meantime, I just want to say so many thanks to Eric and the team for doing this analysis, creating this awesome report, and crunching the data, because if you hadn't done it, the Storms team had it on our queue to do it ourselves. So you're setting us up for a great next expanded effort for this project that we anticipate working on. And with that, I am going to skim through the checklist. I see none. Daniel, do we have any last minute burning desire questions?
Yes, we got a couple more questions in the last minute or so. This one is from Amanda, who's representing OC Environmental Resources. Has any thought been given to collecting data to answer specific questions regarding funding or spending, i.e. how much is your municipality spending on X activity versus collecting broad/general spending information? Without the context of answering specific questions, data collection and evaluation is very difficult and of limited utility.
I'll just answer that or address that question. The level of detail within the activity reporting, so you have categories and activities, and I think generally the activity level of reporting is informative, but you can also understand how it wouldn't necessarily be informative enough to know how to allocate funds within that category, particularly in terms of sort of the general set of municipal like expenditure reporting that gets summaried up. There's different levels of planning that where summary numbers are useful, right? And so this study where the data exists really addresses what would be kind of the local summary, regional summary, and statewide snapshot level. But it may, I think there's always going to be a value to having, you know, a separate internal worksheet that knows how many hours you're spending on a particular activity on a particular sub-activity within an activity. But trying to capture that level of detail and standardize it, I think we heard from folks in the community through the comments that that seems like a pretty daunting challenge to try to standardize that, even though it would be probably helpful to have a common framework to do it. It just, there's a lot of diversity in the way finances happen across the state.
And I'll just touch real quick upon that last comment. We've heard that as well at the State Water Board, that the differences in cost tracking, reporting, evaluation, in addition to how individual municipalities are organized, differs greatly. And so a small municipality may have a completely different set of resources and capabilities for tracking data than a large municipality like a large municipality. And so that's another consideration we have. I am, again, open to developing possible individual case studies or exploring that as a possibility in the future. We have done surveys in the past, both by Office of Water Programs and open requests for this type of information. Historically, the response rate can be relatively low. So we're going to try a different approach through datathons, seminars like this one, or direct engagement as much as we can. And we're open to it. It's just what data we can get and what we can actually do with what we receive. Daniel, we have about 5 more minutes before I want to wrap the event. How many more questions do we have? And do we have any quick ones for the last 5 minutes?
Yeah, there's 2 questions remaining. I'll shoot the first one now, and we have time for the second one. We'll get to it. This one's from Gerald from CWE Consulting. Their questions are, do the expenditure estimates assume TMDL or basin plan compliance? Is this an apples and oranges comparison or expenditure versus needs?
That sort of information would be captured in the annual reporting in a more qualitative fashion, I believe. And so we did not attempt to do an assessment about the sufficiency of the expenditures. We simply wanted to identify how much was being spent. But I think if you went back to the reporting or through kind of case study focus groups, you could identify that question. But it's a tricky one to know whether you're spending enough money to comply with TMDL compliance. It's sort of at the heart of some of the difficulties that have been, that have faced this question over the years. so we decided to take the first step, which is how much is being spent, and capture that to be able to set as a baseline for some of those more difficult questions around sufficiency that would come later.
Great. And the last question that's come in so far is from Ken, representing Murray Tech Law. Their question is, I'm wondering if the data indicates how municipalities struggle with capital costs versus expense. For example, are their efforts impeded by a lack of either one, and which is typically more available for the municipalities?
Excellent question. So I don't recall a good way that that is captured within the quantitative reporting that we extracted. Again, that might be something that's evaluated more qualitatively, but I think that the program reports are a better opportunity to describe, the accomplishments that are going on. That's their purpose and the value of showing, the work that's going on at local and county levels. So the information, the quantitative information that's in there does not sort of capture shortfalls or the difficulties in acquiring, say, capital funding, which is kind of a very localized context question, access to funds or something like that. If you created a longer record, if you're able to kind of continue to do this work over time, I think you might be able to examine, say, access to funding, say, local funding that goes up and down with economic trends, and start to tease out some of that availability of information. But again, it requires a reproducible set of moderately standardized data that's a comprehensive snapshot across the state for some number of years before you can start to say that.
Fantastic. Daniel, do we have any last minute burning desire questions, or should we close Q&A?
One final one is a follow-up from Ken, who just asked that previous question. Also wondering if there is any information that indicates the number of jobs created or that might be created related to effective stormwater management.
We have this in our asset management toolkit because we captured sort of allowed for the opportunity for number of hours and so forth, but generally the annual program reports did not go into this amount of detail. I'm sort of remembering some that would provide sort of number of hours, which you could track, FTEs over time, but it wasn't all program reports, and I don't even think I would say it was a majority of program reports. So it wasn't, we focused on the summary numbers. In a few program reports, you'd be able to go in and kind of dig out FTEs, which would then help you again over time look at job growth trends.
Awesome. No, thank you so very much, Eric, and thank you for everybody on the seminar for participating in today's event. With that, I am going to close Q&A, and I'm going to attempt to pull up poll number 2, basically giving the Storms team feedback on what you thought of us today. Did you enjoy this event? Would you do another one? Do we have things that we need to work on? Please let us know. I will allow this particular poll to be live for about 15 more seconds, and then we will go ahead and do announcements for the next upcoming Storm seminar. We have about 60% of our vote rate. I'm going to end polling now. Thank you for participating. And I'm glad to hear that, yes, everybody or most of you would be very thrilled with participating again. And if the individual that thinks we could do logistics a little bit better, please shoot us an email and let us know what we can do to improve. I'm going to stop sharing this poll right now and move on to the next upcoming Storm seminar. Mark your calendars for October 5th, 2020. Our next seminar will be in partnership with the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA for short. We'll be having Dr. Nathaniel Schultz and his team presenting on examples of geospatial modeling to identify vulnerability hotspots across large landscape gradients of urbanization. It's going to be a really exciting topic, and we look forward to sharing more with that information soon. Storms is actively creating our marketing flyer. And if you jump onto the Storms Eventbrite page where you made your RSVP for this seminar, you can see that the placeholder RSVPs are already live. So please jump on over there, make your reservation, and be ready to join us on October 5th for our next Storms seminar. With that, I want to say thank you for sticking around for this 1.5 hour event, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Have a lovely day, be safe, and thank you, Eric, for participating with us on this.
Thanks. Stay safe and healthy, everybody.
All right, with that, I'm going to end the recording and close the meeting. Thanks for participating. Bye-bye.